Here's another one. What about the problem of evil? Now, most of the time, when the problem of evil comes up, I hear it waged against Christians or against the idea that God exists. And most people offer this as a stumper. If God is all powerful and all great, why is there so much evil in the world? Anybody heard this idea? Yeah, of course. Well, again, in the reason-giving game, you got to play both sides. William Lane Craig, who's a famous apologist, was lecturing down in San Diego when I was attending it, and he was talking on the problem of evil and pain, and he gave the answer that shows that it is not illogical for an all-great God to exist and evil to exist simultaneously. And a woman asks after that, well, that may be fine, but what about animals? And what about animals? Well, okay, people are sinners, but why should animals be inflicted with pain? This was her concern. I mean, with all of the grief that's going on in the world, she was concerned about the animals. And the response, I thought, is very interesting. The answer is, yeah, that's a good question. How does your worldview deal with that? What? Well, you see, the problem of evil isn't only a problem for individuals who hold to the gospel. The problem of evil is a problem for all people at all times in Earth's history. How does the atheist answer the problem of evil? The atheist holds there is no God, that all of this that we experience is the result of random processes and natural selection and the blind laws of nature inflicting upon us. So some people live good lives, some people come down with cancer, some people have tragedy in their lives. It just is. Atheists' response, or atheists' idea of the problem of evil is what? Survival of the fittest. That's the atheist worldview, right? If you hold to an evolutionary paradigm, survival of the fittest is how the species advanced. So if you're not fit, then you should be weeded out. This is why the eugenics movement in the 1920s gained such ground, because it was sprung off of the concept of Darwinian evolution. But that's a terrible answer to the problem of evil. What kind of comfort do you find in that? Also, pantheism, the Eastern religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, religions like that. How do they answer the problem of evil? Well, basically they say that evil is illusory. It doesn't really exist. There is no actual evil. See, you have to go within yourself to find nirvana or attain the highest enlightenment, depending on which religious system that you're talking about. But the concept is to ultimately rid yourself of those feelings. Say Buddhism, for example. You should neither love too much nor hate too much. You should neither have too much joy or too much pain. The idea is to pull back into yourself so that you're always in balance. And once you achieve ultimate balance, nirvana, you blow out like a candle blowing out. So the pantheistic faiths, do they deal with evil? No, they ignore evil. They ignore the suffering. Is that a good solution for you, to just ignore the child in pain? Doesn't seem to be a good solution to me. Some hold to a liberal theism, a modified theism that says that God can't do something about evil. Well, God, started the universe, but he really has to leave it run on its own. It's up to us to solve the problem of evil. That's a dangerous and really heretical position, because what that gives you is a God that's not in control, and that means that he's no God at all. So when I talk to the skeptic, I will ask him, well, that problem of evil, that's a really good question. What kind of comfort can you offer the Holocaust victim or the parents of the child with cancer? How do you comfort them in your worldview? You hold that God doesn't exist? Then what do you tell the parents of the child with cancer? Well, I guess she wasn't fit enough. I guess that's just the luck of the draw. Does anybody find solace in that? Christopher Hitchens was a very famous atheist who passed away a couple of years from esophageal cancer. And before he died, he never converted, but he did make some interesting admissions. And here's one. He writes, quote, "Before I was diagnosed with esophageal cancer a year and a half ago, I rather jauntily told readers in my memoirs that when faced with extinction, I wanted to be fully conscious and awake in order to do death in the active and not passive sense. And I do still try to nurture that little flame of curiosity and defiance, wow, willing to play out the string to the end and wishing to be spared nothing that properly belongs to a lifespan. However, one thing that grave illness does is to make you examine familiar principles and seemingly reliable sayings. And there's one that I find that I'm not saying with quite the same conviction as I once used to. In particular, I have slightly stopped issuing the announcement that, quote, whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. In fact, I now sometimes wonder why I ever thought it profound at all." And Mr. Hitchens has passed away. Is that true? Whatever doesn't kill us makes us stronger? Well, not necessarily. I mean, look at nature. Black widows will eat their mates. The concept of spreading DNA is what powers the natural world. And in that aspect, then how do we justify putting up laws about rapists and things like that? The idea that the problem of evil can be wiped away by rejecting God is silly. In fact, Christian, you have the best answer to the question, what about the problem of evil? We must understand how evil and suffering are portrayed in the Christian worldview, in the Christian life. Number one, know that God understands our sufferings and cares about our situations. In Luke chapter 5, Jesus tells us, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 cents? Yet not one of them is forgotten before God. Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not fear. You are more valuable than many sparrows." Isn't it more comforting to know that we sit in the hands of the Father who is protecting us and will not give us more than we can bear? Psalm 34:18. "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." And of course, 1 Peter 5:7 tells us to cast all our cares upon him, for he cares for you. Know that God understands our sufferings and cares about our situation. That gives me comfort that there is a God, the master who has created the universe, will care about me singly so much to number the hairs on my head. But God merely doesn't just care about our situation. He allows it for specific reasons. Just because we don't understand why we suffer doesn't mean that our suffering isn't allowed for a reason. Again, James chapter 1, the apostle clearly states, "Consider it all joy, brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance." It's not whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. It is, if the Christian is walking in faith, then he can be assured that the sufferings are regulated by God, controlled by God, and ultimately will bring about glorification of God. That's not a guarantee for those who are not in the faith. God is working all things together for good to those who love him, and we can take solace in that. Think of Joseph from Genesis. We all know the story of Joseph, right? It should be a fairly familiar one. 17 years old, has, 10 older brothers and sisters, or 10 older brothers plus sisters, and he's captured by his brothers, sold off to the Ishmaelite traders. You remember the whole thing. Although, even though he was prophesied to be, or had a dream that he would one day rule, have his brothers bow down to him. Now, Joseph is only one of 2 individuals in the Old Testament no sin is actually attributed to him. which is very interesting, I think. But yet he goes through this horrific trial where first he's thrown off, loses his family, gets sold by Ishmaelite traders, gets landed as in Potiphar's house, right? And so he's a slave now. He's not part of the family, he's a slave. But he does his good work, and he's even earnest enough to make sure that he doesn't fall when tempted by Potiphar's wife. So how does God reward this? Does he let Joseph free from his slavery? No. He gets thrown in prison because of it. Right? It's like, you guys ever have a Joseph moment where you're going through a trial and you think you're doing the right thing, and all of a sudden it gets worse? That's terrible. That's awful. And it's not until the king has a dream, the Pharaoh has a dream, that Joseph is released from that prison and then ultimately saves the world. Joseph says to his brothers later, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, that many may be saved." Now, I want you to think about this. When we see Joseph's story, we see him going like down, down, down before he gets ultimately exalted. But think about it from God's perspective. What was God doing with Joseph? First, he allowed Joseph to help manage the family business, which was a rather small enterprise. Then he allowed Joseph to manage the affairs of an entire household of a civil servant. Then he allowed Joseph to run and manage an entire government agency in the prison before he allowed Joseph to run and manage the valuable grain of the entire world. While we see it as Joseph being beleaguered and knocked down, God was ever expanding his experience so he would be ready to save the world when that time comes. Similarly, with our sufferings, we tend to look at it from our perspective. It keeps getting worse. But that may not be how God's looking at it, because he ultimately wants to work everything together for the good, for those who love him and are the called according to his purposes. And most importantly probably, Christianity only offers the true solution to the problem of evil and suffering, and that is in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Here is the answer. Atheism doesn't have this answer. Pantheism doesn't have this answer. Christianity offers consider that God is not unaware of our sufferings, yet he suffered for us. Jesus' love caused him to suffer and die on that cross. Jesus felt, right? He was tempted in all points as we were, yet without sin. Right? He suffered and he took on all of those burdens that we may be made righteous before God. So Jesus suffered, he felt the suffering. But the Father also suffered as well. The suffering was even greater in the crucifixion and resurrection because the Father had to give his only Son so that the world may be saved. Now think about this. In the relational aspect of the Trinity, the Father had to give up his Son to die for humanity's sake. I don't know about most of you, but I have 4 boys, and I think it would be easier for me to suffer than to see them suffer. I mean, which one of you as a parent wouldn't say, I would take that cancer from my child and apply it to myself gladly before I see them do it? So the sake of suffering, the idea that God can meet us where we are and understand our suffering is replete throughout the Trinity. Paul tells us that the sufferings of this present age are not to be compared with the glories that are to come. And that's what we look forward to. This is our answer as Christians. Christianity gives us the power to deal with our difficulties, and it gives us the person of Christ to whom we can appeal. And no other worldview has the answer to the problem of evil and suffering as Christianity does. So, what about the problem of evil? That's a good question to talk to folks about.